spangled eyes. Oh, they send you off to war. When you ask them how much should we give, oh, the only answer is more, 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 more. It ain't me, it ain't me.
Yes. I'm here with my friend Jim Stewartson, my colleague Jim Stewartson, my very, very brave warrior buddy. Um, Jim, yeah, Hi-Fi had this vision that we would each tell our stories, and we've told his, and now we're going to tell yours. And I think the best place to go is just to jump right in from the beginning and tell people a bit about your youth, a snapshot of your youth.
Okay, well, I have to say that I am absolutely happy to be here with you, Heidi. I always love talking to you. I am not a huge fan of talking about myself, but I will indulge the process. And uh, let's see, my childhood was me and my mom. Um, my parents divorced when I was 18 months old or something like that. And the last time I saw my dad was when I was three. And so we moved to DC from Brooklyn, which is where I was born. And I grew up in Maryland for, all my life until I moved to California. Um, I was precocious in terms of being very far ahead of all my classmates. And they made the fateful decision to skip me a grade, which is something that they did way back then. And I didn't really have social skills. I'm neurodiverse. I'm, a little bit weird. And it was a nightmare. I'm going to be honest with you. Um, and, I got picked on a lot. And, that experience through elementary school and junior high school, um, gave me a very, very aggressive attitude about bullies. I do not like bullies. I, was tormented as a kid. And when I see people engaging in that behavior, I ain't gonna lie, it triggers me. And so when I saw that the, biggest bullies in the world were going after my fucking country, that's when I got involved in all this stuff. Um, but yeah,
Yeah.
it's bullies, and I don't want to get into a bunch of my psychology, mainly because my trolls will use it against me.
Right.
Um, excuse me. Um, but yeah, it was a formative time. I was very solitary, um, you know, which is partly why I operate like I do. I was never a good student. Was always a great test taker, which
Hmm.
is how I got through everything. I
Hmm.
would just fucking show up for the test and get a C because I didn't do any of the homework, and
Hmm.
that's how I got through.
I knew that guy. I knew that guy. That guy was really smart because I was an excellent student and an okay test taker.
Yeah,
Um,
I
it's
was.
it's
I was the opposite. I just because I just learned on my own. That's what I always did as a
wow.
kid, and that's what I've been doing. As an adult.
So we're going to get to that defiance and sense of justice against bullies because I think that's another thing that definitely unites some of us in this tribe. Um, but I also think it's important to kind of look at music roots because I know that music saved my life and punk rock saved my life, and there were periods of time when hip hop saved my life, and you know, music, absolutely saved my life. And when did you kind of find your people, or did you? Were you still solitary within the punk scene?
No, that's there was when I went to high school and, left most of my bullies behind me, um, you know, suddenly things were much better. um, it still wasn't, great, in the beginning, but I did find my people. And we started a band. We started lots of bands. Starting in, I don't know, 8th grade or 9th grade, I started learning how to play bass. Everybody needed a fucking bass player. So I had lots and lots of friends now because I could play the bass and I loved it. I was, even though I was I am naturally extremely shy, and people may have a hard time believing that. It gave me a way to express myself in a way that was, allowed, right? And felt good. And I gravitated immediately to the DC punk scene because that's what was going on, and it was, it was huge. It was where, I saw the second Fugazi show at DC Space, with 50 people, and like I played, which is a club that I played, I don't know, 50, 60 times, over years, and even though it was punk rock, and even though it was, sort of anarchic at its core, it gave me structure. We had to practice. We had to figure out how to get to places. We had to do all this stuff, and so that actually, was a positive, structural thing. It was just me and my mom, so I didn't have a lot of structure in my life, so that gave me things to do. School, on the other hand, I didn't give a shit about. Never did.
And one of the things that I think is really important, and I didn't realize how important it was until my daughter, who's a really renowned poet, she actually interviewed Jane Fonda a few years ago, and Jane Fonda said, you have to work in tribes, you have to work in groups, you have to find your community. And I know that I'm kind of a bit of a isolationist at heart, but I do know that finding community wherever it was, even if it shifts and changes and morphs, is really critical to, I think, my overall sense of kind of emotional security. And so what I love about what I imagine that punk scene was like is that it probably was like it was in many different parts of the country, sort of a sea of misfits. So you could come as you are, you could be yourself, and you could be embraced for your uniqueness as opposed to the Biffs of the world where you sort of had to fit in.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I had a mohawk for a while, and it that's a uniform too, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's a uniform that you can fucking lay out any way you want. The only sort of requirement was that you let everyone know that you don't give a shit, right? Which is do something with your hair, wear weird fucking clothes, go to, crazy concerts, all that stuff. And I mean, the punk scene was in its own way organized political movement, but it was one that I immediately resonated with, and DC was a really interesting place, right? Because it's 90% black. I grew up in the suburbs, and my high school was extremely diverse. It was like 40% white people, and then a mixture of lots and lots of other people, and that was also very formative because I literally just never, other than when I would hear about it, like the whole idea of racism just never came up, right? In my own personal group, because we were everybody,
right?
And so that that also, I think, gave me a fundamental worldview that multiculturalism and just being a human being with others is what matters. And when
Yeah.
people try and divide us based on things that I know make no difference at all, that also is something that I can never put away.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and finally, if we're going to get to grievances, I grew up with a single mom my entire life. Women have always been my best friends, and so misogyny, is another thing. Just because of my upbringing, because I was around women all the time, you know, uh, misogyny is another thing that gets me boiling.
Yeah, and misogyny, as we know, has been the gateway drug to so much of this horrible radicalization we've seen. So we're going to talk about that. I love what you said about your youth. And again, being from San Francisco, growing up in the 70s, diversity being celebrated, all the things that people fought for in the 60s, we had that kind of freedom in the 70s, and it was so beautiful. Um, and as we entered the 80s, I hated everything. I rejected everything. I mean, I say I hate the 80s, and of course, I can look back and think about some music that I did cherish, but everything became about wealth, greed is good, all that crap. And again, that is why my friends who grew up with sort of a more punk mindset, that was not about wealth. It was the antithesis of that. So if you were from the wrong side of the tracks, or you weren't able to wear the latest trend or whatever, and you actually did shop at thrift shops, that was cool. And that's something that still played
Yeah,
into my life later in my 20s and the 90s, and
there,
that
there's,
that
there's a
period.
reason for punk, right? That it was Ronald Reagan.
Yeah. Right, right, yeah. Oh my god, I think of, oh my
I mean,
god.
that, like, we got to remember, like, the 80s, was a very, very intense period politically, right? Reagan was doing all kinds of horrible shit. He was,
Mhm.
bringing up welfare queens and all the
Mhm.
racist shit he was doing. Um, you know, uh, Pushing the Cold War fever pitch so he could,
Mhm.
invade other countries. And in the middle of all that are many of the people who are still doing it now,
Right.
including Flynn, Oliver North,
Roger
Bill
Stone.
Barr,
Yeah.
John Singlaub,
Yeah.
who's Mike Flynn's mentor,
Yeah.
was working for, basically ran Iran-Contra for Reagan.
Yeah.
So that's what, the 80s was pushing back against a very, very serious internal threat from the
Yes.
right wing.
Yes. I feel very grateful that I can recall my love of President Carter, and that my love of President Carter was never tarnished due to the revisionist history of the 80s and of the revisionist history of the Reagan era. And again, I can probably credit the guidance of music for a lot of that. And also, I was a voracious reader. And I don't know if you share that in common, but it's like the books that I read in the 80s into the 90s, and of course in the 70s. I mean, I started reading the second I could. Um, that really helped me stay focused on like the truth. Again, we didn't have that fake reality push that we now study and fight against, like, for example, what's been happening in Russia for the last 20 years, the revisionist history of Stalin, and memory holing, as Ruth would say, all the things that they don't want people to think about, and looking for the bits that they can celebrate. Obviously, we had some of that. Now we have a lot of that. But I do think that uh, having my head in books having my ears always listening to some music that had some sort of meaning to me helped me navigate uh, the truth of our times pretty well.
Yeah. I mean, I read a lot of science fiction,
That's
um,
interesting.
which is which was a combination of those two things.
That's interesting.
The I it was a way for me to read fiction and hear narratives about human beings, but it was also looking into the future, a visionary thing that I could sort of compare notes with and see if it was interesting. Which is a trait I share with Elon Musk. He read science fiction too, but he read it literally and is trying to recreate it with billions of dollars at the cost of humanity. And I looked at it as information, as input to add to my understanding of the world.
Right.
So
Well, that we're gonna.
that was a lot. I read a lot of science fiction and a lot of science. I not read. I read astronomy books. That was mostly what I read when I was a kid. I could tell you, to the mile, the diameter and circumference of all the planets and all this shit.
Wow.
Like when I was 5, because
Wow.
that was what was most interesting to me. What do I not
Cool.
know, right?
Mhm.
And there's this giant, blue or black thing, depending on what time it is up there, and I have no fucking idea what's going on.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to learn about that. So I wasn't gonna be an astronomer until I found music.
That's so cool. Well, as you know, all of my best friends are bass players, and all of my exes are drummers. It's like I'm sure
That makes perfect
psychologically
sense.
it does make perfect sense, right? Yeah. Yeah, it's really funny. But I mean, and again, most of my friends who are bass players, as I always joke, are guitarists who wanted to eat. They taught themselves bass because everybody had a guitarist, but everybody needed a bass player,
Right.
Um, so, I find it interesting that when I look at the people who are closest to me in this fight, we have music that unites us, and we also have, I think, a love of reading too, which I think is really important. And I never realized how important it was until our guest on Radpod, Volodymyr Demchenko, who is a soldier in the Ukraine army, was actually talking about how he was able to beat back Russian disinformation, which he was, fed ever since he was a kid, because he read books, and books told a different story. And those books that he read gave him armor against disinformation. And as we know, we live in a time when people have stopped reading and they mostly flip on the television to get their information. And that's a very dangerous place
What's
to
the first
be.
thing any fascist does is burn books, right?
Yeah, right.
I
I mean,
mean, because
amazing.
they don't want you fucking having other ideas other than whatever their ideology is.
Whatever
That's
they're
the whole
planting in
point.
your brain. Yeah, that's I did some research. It was important to me when I found out when we had uh, Peter Tatchell on, and he mentioned Magnus Hirschfeld, and Magnus Hirschfeld had started the first basic gender fluidity institution in Berlin in the 20s. He
Hmm.
himself was a gay man. He ended up traveling all over the world, writing about gender fluidity, writing about homosexuality, writing about the differences, and celebrating the uniqueness of people. And at his institution was actually where they did the very first surgery for a trans woman. And why this is so fascinating is I figured out that the very first books that were burned in Berlin in 1933 were his books. They burned and absolutely destroyed his legacy, which is why his name people don't know, and which is why I'm bringing it up, because I want people to know the name Magnus Hirschfeld. He was incredible. And again, it's exactly what you just said, and those are the first books to burn.
I mean, what? There's literally no difference between what they're doing now, right? They're
Yeah,
banning any books that mention, don't say gay. It's the same goddamn thing.
yeah, that's right.
Which is, DeSantis banning books and teachers from any discussion about gender, which is just so sick and bananas. And yes, it is absolutely the same thing.
A,
Hitler and the
hun-
fascists did.
100 years later, here we are, same shit, same
Yeah,
playbook, and
we haven't learned anything.
I'm glad that we have a show, and I'm glad that we have our writings to help illuminate it and to help fight against it. Because if I were just sitting idly on the sidelines, knowing all of this, I wouldn't, I just wouldn't be able to deal with that. It feels very important to be able to reach people, even if it's one at a time. And so that's why I'm grateful. Um, so you had an interesting segue from music to working and getting involved early on in computers and in technology. And like many people involved in technology, you chose hand on rather than college. And can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I tried college for a semester, and oh my god, it just drove me fucking crazy. 'Cause it was either teaching me stuff I didn't care about or stuff I already knew, for the most part, and it was just me. Um, so I ended up, I was a bartender for a while, and then I moved to San Francisco, uh, which is where my friends who were in all the bands I was in had
Mm-hmm.
moved. So I
Mm-hmm.
moved there to be in bands,
Interesting.
and um, when I was there, I was just finding a job, and just briefly, I took a temp job moving boxes. And the person who was running that temp job ended up hiring me to run his warehouse. And then after another 6 months, I was vice president of central planning for a women's clothing company. Like,
Wow. And
what the
this was
fuck?
the night.
Which sounds
This is
very
the
Soviet, by the way, right?
this was
I'm vice
90s, right?
president of central planning. Um, but I actually had that fucking title, which is the craziest thing.
It's so cool.
And but it was all done on these giant, like all of the. So what I was supposed to buy all the fabric and do all the stuff and figure out how to get all the things we needed in order to create women's clothes. And everything was done on literally grid paper, and I was like,
Ah,
what are we
yes.
doing? And
Yes.
so I'd been playing with computers since I had a TRS-80 in, I don't know, whenever that was, 1979 or something. And so I was like, we're going to computerize this, and so I did. I computerized the entire office, and now I had a PC. And what did I start doing? I started making graphics, because
Mm.
I whatever, I had this women's clothing company going, and but what I was really interested in was what I could do creatively with this computer. And so I started designing kids' clothes, just with graphics, and went to the kids designer that was in the company, and she ended up selling it to like Mervyn's and Macy's and like all this, like tens of thousands of My Little Purple Dinosaurs on Wheels, like in Mervyn's.
That's amazing.
And so I was in this weird spot where I, like, this job I could not give a shit about. I, like, sorry, women's clothing, I don't care. But I did it for the money. But then it led me into, ooh, I could do cool stuff with computers, and so I just quit
Yeah.
and started doing that, and
Wow.
started my first company called Eponymous Press in, God, 1993.
Wow.
And so I from that point forward was basically working on the internet on computers. And what was that, 30 years ago?
Wow. Wow. Wow, were the 90s that long ago? Oh my God, yeah.
30 years
That's
ago. Yeah, is when I
crazy.
started.
Damn, that's so crazy. I still feel like I have one foot in the 90s because I do love the 90s. Um, wow, so that's funny because I'm sure we probably have some of the same friends from San Francisco because that was my scene too. And I used to hang at a punk bar in the early 90s before I came back to LA,
Which
um,
one?
on Haight. It was a punk bar on Haight.
Like near the
All,
park,
it was Lower
or down,
Haight,
or was it Lower Haight?
Lower Haight, Lower Fillmore. Because I
Because
lived on,
the
I lived Upper Fillmore, Lower Pacific Heights. I lived across from a bar called Harry's. I think it's
hmm
called Harry's. But there was a really cool punk bar. It'll come to me probably at some point in this interview.
I mean, there was
Um,
also like down right in there. There was like the Divisadero and like all
yeah.
the there was big clubs and stuff there too.
And of course,
And
there was Berkeley, which was very cool as well, because
yeah,
I got
I
to spend some
I
time there
actually opened for Green Day.
at Gilman Street. At Gilman Street, or
Yes, on at
yeah,
924 Gilman Street.
yeah,
Opened for Green Day like in 93,
that's awesome.
92. I don't know what it was,
Yeah,
but it was. I had no idea who they were. They were fucking awesome.
yeah, yeah. They're great.
There
I
was 50
was
people there.
I was writing for BAM magazine in that era, and I was living in San Francisco on Fillmore, and I had seen the Counting Crows perform, and I forget who else they were performing with, but it was like a Gilman, a place like that. If
hmm
I look at my BAM archives, I could figure it out. And Adam had dropped off a mixtape at my apartment like the day after the show or something, and it had like 20 songs on it. It wasn't like a 3-song mixtape. It was like, 2 dozen songs. I got to find that tape. I'm sure I have it somewhere still. But he was mad at me for years because when I reviewed him, I did mention his rock star posturing. I remember using those words. I always remember the words that I used. And I ran into him years later at the Viper Room, and he was still mad about that. But he did fine. Things worked out fine for the Counting Crows. So
Yeah, how it goes.
it worked out just fine. But
Yeah,
yeah, no, it was cool.
mixtapes were the way that you expressed your love to each other, to people for a
Oh,
lifetime.
oh my God, Airplane Music Volume 1 is why I married my children's father. He made me a mixtape of punk rock songs called Airplane Music Volume 1, probably like 94. And those are still like all my favorite songs. It had The Damned on it and Generation X and some modern songs like Nirvana's like Love Buzz, but a lot of older British stuff, which was amazing. So yeah, that's right.
hmm
We need to bring that back. Express your love through a mixtape, everybody.
Yeah,
Um,
well, I mean, tapes are such a pain. You got to rewind them, and
I
they
still love
fucking,
them. I
you
just
know,
looked at my box. I have so many boxes of cassettes. My kids kind of take them sometimes, but I was a music critic for a long time, so I would get the advanced cassettes, and yeah, it was a drag when they got jammed up and you had to use a pencil and try to get it. But one point I do want to make, and this is something that my kids kind of have their minds blown by, and that it makes me feel really bad, is that as an artist, I think you'll understand that we could actually live as writers and musicians in little apartments in San Francisco or Hollywood, not really have a job. Most of us were pretty unemployable, but do the creative things that gave us fuel, and we could pay our rent, we could get by, and that was a beautiful thing about that period of the 90s. And my kids cannot relate to that because you either got to go right to Google the Death Star, or you have to live with a bunch of different people, and or hope that your family member inherited a house or something. But it's not the same. It's not the same way where you could actually pursue your dreams, uh, and pay your bills.
yeah. I mean, that's the fundamental grievance that is being exploited by a lot of people, right?
Yeah,
And it's
right.
the fundamental. It is. I mean, there is a reason for that grievance
Yeah,
because we have all these fucking billionaires,
right.
that are all psychopaths because you have to be one to get there.
Yeah.
And they literally sucked out all of the money from the lower and middle class. And now they're going after Social Security and Medicare. I mean,
Yeah.
there is a reason why people are pissed off.
Yeah. And we got
it started in the 70s and 80s under Reagan, is when the disparity between productivity and wealth broke. And from that point forward, the divide has been getting larger.
Yes.
And when it gets large enough, you end up with the fucking French Revolution. I mean,
right.
And we're not quite there yet, but that's what we're seeing.
We're getting there. Yeah. Well,
I mean, behind all of this shit is genuine anger.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is, this wealth disparity that, Reagan, speaking of, got started.
Yeah. So what I find interesting just about this moment in time is that I am once again attempting to be an independent writer, as I was for many years, 30 years ago. And I'm stubborn and I'm defiant, and it's happening. Like, I'm making this happen. I'm working with that team out of the UK. I'm doing it independently. And if I can do this, if I can actually pull this off, it'll make the whole damn thing worth it. And I'm going to try, because I feel like in my line, I've always, my background is journalism. And, it's not that it's dead, but it's broken. And there's a new model that's coming. And I think that new model is going to be reader funded, because the only way we're going to be able to truly have a chance to beat back the fake realities set up by these billionaires and oligarchs is if there is a truly independent press, because hedge fund press and billionaire owned press is not going to help us fight this war. And most of the people I know are working for the corporate hedge fund billionaire owned media, and they are not our friend. They may have some great reporters and they may have some good stories, but they cannot consistently fight the way that we can as independents. So I'm happy that we found each other, which brings us to first kind of give people a snapshot of what your area of expertise was with your tech background that made you highly attuned to recognize what was happening in the radicalization period a couple of years ago.
Sure. Well, I mean, so going back to my sci-fi roots, I love the Star Trek and the holodeck, right? I love the idea that you could walk into any place and at any time and talk with anyone you wanted. That sounds, absolutely amazing. And I very, very early in web programming and all of that, and I saw a little ad in 1995 for somebody to make a 3D game for Star Trek. And I was like, oh my God, I have no idea how to do that. It was 1995. There were barely pictures in that, right? But I was like, yes, sure, I'll do it. And then I just taught myself how to do it over the next 3-4 weeks and delivered a game that was the first 3D game on the web.
Wow, that's amazing. Star Trek. That's incredible.
And it was that experience that made everything else happen. I mean, before that, I'd been doing some cool shit in VR and whatnot, and building websites, really early and all that. But this was like, oh my God, I'm the first person to do this ever. It was, and 6 million people saw it, which is a lot back then. And so I suddenly now had, something I could point to, and I started my own company, which I've done numerous times now. And it was 3D, it was VR, but on the internet, on the web. And so I've been building worlds online for 30 years.
It's amazing.
Right? So
it's amazing.
That's the very beginning of my thing. And then, I ended up selling that company. It wasn't a big transaction, but I got out in 2000, right before everything, collapsed.
Yeah.
And was involved in a company that did facial animation using computer vision, and so I was super early in augmented reality and all of that. But it was the next company that's the most relevant, and I was a founder of a company called 42 Entertainment, and we built alternate reality games.
Yeah.
So the first really big alternate reality game was for Spielberg's movie AI, and I was working with the team at Microsoft who was running that game.
Wow.
And it was mind blowing. It was hundreds of these websites that you had to discover on your own. The rabbit hole into it was there was a phone number embedded in the movie poster of AI.
Mm-hmm.
There was an extra credit in the poster that was Janine Sala, sentient machine therapist.
Wow.
And everybody went like, what the fuck is a sentient machine therapist? And they went to like Lycos or Yahoo or whatever the hell the search was.
Oh my God.
And you get to a website and suddenly you're in the year 21 something, I can't remember.
Wow.
And there's a murder. And oh my God, there's a phone number and an email address. And now you're off on this adventure with tens of thousands of others. And so I was involved in that from outside, but working closely with people who are doing it. And we ended up they left Microsoft and we ended up starting a company together called 42. And that was where all of the biggest alternate reality games were done. I'll give you one example, of an alternate reality game to kind of set the stage. Microsoft and Bungie, the game studio, came to us in 2004. I think they came to us in 2003, but we did it in 2004 for Halo 2, for the video game Halo 2. Halo was a massive hit on the Xbox. My partner in 42 was actually chief designer at Xbox. And so we said, yes, like, we want to make an alternate reality game for you, right? Just like the Spielberg one. And we said, what's it about? They said, well, aliens come to Earth and blow shit up. And we were like, well, what does that sound like? It sounds like War of the Worlds.
War of the Worlds, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And if people know about War of the Worlds, there's somewhat apocryphal, but also somewhat true history about Orson Welles doing War of the Worlds over the radio, right? And people would tune in the middle of him simulating a broadcast of the Martians coming to Earth and blowing shit up, and people literally went out in the streets looking for the Martians.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It was the first accidental alternate reality game.
Yeah, right. Oh God, yeah.
Because here was this fictional story that was coming into the real world in a way that, and we're pretty rebellious. We kind of liked that idea.
Mm-hmm.
And so we took a 6-hour radio drama that we produced, right, similar to War of the Worlds. But it was dispatches from the future. It was from the 26th century. And we took this radio drama that described the story in Halo, cut it up into tiny pieces, and we didn't deliver it over the radio, we delivered it over payphones.
So crazy.
Which was literally...
We have to pause and make sure that our audience knows what a payphone is.
A payphone is a phone, a wired phone that goes in the street corner.
You might have
And
seen him in Paddington Bear or something.
and there were cell phones, but there was no iPhone. There was nothing like that at
Yeah.
that point. There was no GPS coordinates on the phones or anything. But we decided to cut it up into little pieces, and then we had literally hundreds of people going all over the country to individual payphones to see if they worked, because payphones were, as cell phones were coming up, that whole system was degrading. So it was this extremely challenging thing that I had to do. I was CTO, but I was also a puppet master, meaning I was a designer on it. So I had to build the system that would call all of these payphones and deliver these stories, these pieces of the story to people on the payphones, right?
Wow.
So in 6 weeks, I built a website that acted like it was crash landed on by a 26th century artificial intelligence, by a 26th century AI called the Operator. And the Operator had crash landed on this beekeeper's website. And the website was like the beekeeper's website, except it was kind of pulsing at the edges, and it had weird shit coming out everywhere. And it was all of a sudden big messages would come up, and there was one frame in a Halo clip where they show Halo 2, this crazy shit happening and shit's blowing up, and then right at the end it goes Xbox.com real small, but it flips for one frame to ilovebees.com.
Wow.
So this is the beekeeper's website. So within a couple hours, I had 250,000 Halo fans on my website.
Nice.
And shit was crashing, and it was crazy because it was just this massive influx of people to this little beekeeper's website that was acting weird, right? And over the next 6 months, we delivered story through this website using only the pictures that were already on the website. We invented ways of inserting clues into the text of like if you open an image in a text editor, we could hide images in there, and it would make the image look kind of weird. Wow. So people figured out eventually, oh shit, if I download it and then open it up in a text editor, I get a message from the Operator, which is a 26th century AI, right? That there was a page on this website that all it had was a list of times and GPS coordinates.
Okay.
And if you went to that GPS coordinate at that time, a payphone would ring on the corner. If you picked up the phone, it was the Operator from the 26th century, this AI, and she would tell you this story, or she would ask you a question, very sternly, and if you got it right, if you knew the story, if you answered her question correctly through voice recognition, I would figure that out and unlock this story bit. Not just for you, but for millions of people who are watching online, right? So we developed so many of these techniques that we still see today during that time, right?
Wow.
All of these ways of interacting with people through different devices. We would send people emails, texts, and all kinds of stuff. That whole period, and so we did that one for Halo 2, and that ended up in a big event at in San Francisco, where 500 Halo fans got to play Halo 2 before anyone else, and blah blah blah. It was a big event. We then did that for Microsoft, and the Dark Knight, and Year Zero. We did an amazing one with Trent Reznor in 2005. 2007. Sorry, for his album Year Zero. That one was amazing because a brief story about this. So Trent came to us and he said, "Here's my album Year Zero. It's about what will happen if the Bush administration stays in power until 2015."
Wow.
And it was this dystopian thing where there were like bad injections and shit, and there was lots and lots of crazy viral stuff. And then there was a point where people were getting handed these little cell phones, these little free cell phones, and we handed out 50 in Los Angeles, and it had a little year zero marker on it. And we told people, keep this phone with you at all times. 3 weeks later, we called all 50 phones, and we said this: you need to show up at this dark corner in Los Angeles at this particular time. That's it. All of them, literally all of them showed up. It was fucking crazy. So 50 of these hardcore Nine Inch Nails fans, right, who had been playing this crazy alternate reality game with us for months, signed a piece of paper that said, anything that happens now is not our responsibility, right? It was like this ridiculously,
release of liability.
It was released, but it was like crazy, like, intentionally so. They all signed it. Then they all got into a bus with aluminum foil on the windows and guys with big guns, like, there to escort them. We escorted them into a room, and there were, 100 people, 50 people in this room, and then lots and lots of scary people around. And this guy comes in, who's an actor, and just rails at them. Why would you sign your life away like that? How do you know that we weren't going to, fill this room with gas? Like, what is wrong with you? I just railed at him for, you need to give a shit. And it was just this very dramatic scene. Then at the end of that, we shuffled them all out into this dark hallway and this dark elevator, and they rode it down to the basement of this place. And they all kind of shuffled into this totally black room, and then bam, Nine Inch Nails is in front of them. Played the best concert I've ever been to. Like, just personally, because they were right there. There was like 50 of us, and it was unbelievable. But the concert, he was playing Fragile on the piano, and in the middle of his piano, that power goes off, the wall caves in on the side, and a bunch of stormtroopers come into this concert, breaking it up and take it and throw him into the drums.
Oh my God.
During rehearsal, Trent was like, "Don't be such a pussy. Fucking throw me harder." I was like, I don't know if he used the word pussy, but he was like, it was like that. It was very, very hardcore, and he wanted
that. Is amazing.
So those people had been through an alternate reality, right? We had taken them physically through this whole experience in this big concert at the end. And then, when the stormtroopers came in, they grabbed me and threw me up against the wall. I was a plant, and they knew it. But my head hit a metal beam, so I had blood coming down my face. So it made it all so much more realistic. I loved it. I was like,
I thought that me getting 3 people in to see Nine Inch Nails at the Probe on Highland was a really great Nine Inch Nails story. That is an epic story. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Trent gave us a song. This is the craziest part of that ARG, actually, is he gave us a song, a new Nine Inch Nails song, which is a big deal, from year zero. And we put it on a single USB drive and put it, I kid you not, in a bathroom on a stall in Barcelona. Mm-hmm. And a Nine Inch Nails fan took the USB drive home, put it in their computer, which, first of all, why would you do that? But he did, and found a Nine Inch Nails song, uploaded it to the internet, and within 90 minutes, they had spectrographed it and discovered that we had implanted through spectrography inside the Nine Inch Nails song a phone number and the cover of the Year Zero band. So if you, in a special piece of software, spectrographed it, you would see this image. That phone number, within the next 2 weeks, got 4 million calls. It was so viral that it was shutting down small telcos like across the Midwest because it was going viral with all these kids. Because on the phone call was really weird. It was like this crazy scene, with zombies and shit, and they loved it. And we had to shut the phone number down because it was costing us $80,000 a week. no, a day. Sorry, $80,000 a day. And I was like, sorry, we can't do this anymore. But that just, it shows you, right, from a USB drive to something that's shutting down telcos, right? It's that experience which taught me all of what I know about what is being weaponized, right?
Right.
So, at the time, like as I'm telling the story, I'm thinking, I would never do that now because I know how badly it can be weaponized.
Well, that's the whole thing. You created something for fun, for joy, for marketing, for whatever. And you saw that if people didn't find the answer right away or whatever, that it created some sort of mania. And maybe we should mention that.
Right, because people, the fact that people were willing to sign their names like that, right? And look, we were very careful all the way through. No one was ever in any danger at all. That was something that was extremely important to us. But you could see that if somebody had bad intentions, and 50 people just got on a bus and signed their lives away, what could you do? All sorts of bad stuff. Like the guy that we had who came in to tell them that they need to give a shit and stop being, lemmings. That guy could have been somebody giving a very, very different message.
Right.
And so, we learned all these techniques. We had fun with them. We built these big games. And I stopped doing that in 2007-8. I started another company that was where I won an Emmy, where we took those games and sort of packaged them into stories that would come to you over your devices, right?
Okay.
So instead of having to go out to the street corner to get a piece of it, we would call you on your phone. So like if there was an emergency at your house right now, right, and this is a drama, you might see you running around. You might see you talking to 911 or something, right? In our story, you'd pick up the phone, dial 911, and the phone in your pocket would ring. So you would listen in on the phone while the conversation was happening, so you could hear the 911 call. And synchronized with what was going on screen, and it broke the company was called Fourth Wall Studios because the point of it was to break fourth wall. Right? Suddenly, the phone that you're picking up and calling is affecting me in the real world right here. It's calling me on my phone, and I was like, and those moments were very magical because people had seen this kind of storytelling before. And it didn't require all the craziness that alternate reality games did.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
So that was a company that I ran for 4 or 5 years that ultimately won an Emmy for interactive fiction.
I recall when I was in college, it was the period of existentialism and relativism, but kind of I was reading a lot of books from both, and there was an Italian author who I've been trying to figure out who it was. I'm going to have to track him down, where that was part of the storytelling, was that you would be walking down a street past a phone booth, and that whoever was calling for you. So it's very, very interesting to know that that's always something that I always just thought that was so freakishly weird. And here you are actually creating events doing that type of stuff. It's very cool. It also shaped you for this fight. So I'm sure is there anything in between that we need to talk about before I move on to when we actually met and the work that you were doing at that time?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I after that company, and I'm not going to get into it, but I also have a very deep. I do not like billionaires, and that is both because of what they're doing to the country and the world, but also because of what they've done to me over the years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have had issues with them, including at that company.
Mm-hmm.
But after that company was done, I went to Google for a year and a half, and I learned how that whole fucking machine works.
Mm-hmm.
And I lasted a year there at Niantic, where they were making Pokemon Go.
Right.
So
That's interesting.
I learned about all of the Google, how all that shit works, and reconfirmed to myself, I am not a company man. I'm not good at taking orders from people. Never have, never will be.
What I find interesting is, in my freelance work, it seems like the wealthier, the wealthier the person that, would be necessarily picking up the tab, the more likely they were to never be able to find their checkbook. And I hate cheapies. I really do. And so I often found that the wealthier they were, the more difficult it was to ever actually get paid
right,
without some kind of pain.
Because the whole reason why they're rich is because they see money as not an exchange of goods and labor,
right?
But as a way to get richer at somebody else's expense.
Yeah, and having to deal with those types of people as a freelance, I would make documentaries and direct and write and whatever. It also made me very allergic to people who don't pay their employees, like Trump. There was many reasons why I was, why I knew him for what he was, because of the type of reporting that I would do, and knowing his affiliations with Ponzi schemes and scammers and not paying people. But that's a particular breed of human that I'm not fond of. So I, like 60,000 other people, found your work on Twitter and used to check you like an oasis of sanity every morning, because I was already 4 years or so into the war when we met. And it was very vital that I was able to review your work and see somebody who understood what was happening, who understood that there was radicalization going on, and who actually understood the techniques of it. And what you just explained about your background in technology and ARG made you very adept at understanding how people were being radicalized and the techniques that were being used, specifically in QAnon. And you were able to dive into that world with an advantage because you'd been one of the creators of this type of, alternate world. So 60,000 of us found you. And I always think it's very important to point out that we will always owe you and others like you a debt for having told people to stay away on January 6th, because that should have been something that was being done as a national emergency. Instead, it was Twitter feeds like people like you who warned people like me who had to be present for the Women's March, but knew I better stay home on January 6th of 2021. And so let's just, first of all, thank you. and then let's back up to what you initially read or saw that started to take you down, the world into the research that has really been, I'm sure, your life's work.
Yeah. Well, summer 2020, I was going through kind of a transition, and I started paying attention to what was going on in Portland.
Yes.
With the fucking DHS and the cops and everybody collaborating to, riot against protesters in Portland. And so I was really interested in what was causing this conflict, because it was scary. It was obviously radicalization. I noticed QAnon. I had been vaguely tracking it, before that. But an old colleague of mine named Adrian Hahn wrote a piece that said QAnon is an ARG, is an alternate reality game. And that, I'd sort of heard things like that in the past. I was not a big into 4chan culture and all that shit before. So I came into it sort of fresh. And, I looked at it and I was like, yep, it's an ARG. But it's an ARG that is resulting in a death cult. Right? So I read that, and the first thing I did was just go to QAnon on Twitter. Because at that point, for a long time, all the QAnon people were like attacking Chrissy Teigen and shit for being, child eating, whatever. Mm-hmm. Just ridiculous. But Twitter kind of cut that off at one point and sort of segmented them into their own corner of Twitter. So you could kind of escape it, but I went over there to look, and the first half an hour I spent there changed my life, because I saw hundreds of thousands of people, at a time, literally chanting the same horrid, racist, homophobic, just misogynistic garbage over and over again. And most of them had 3 stars in their bio, or digital soldier in their bio, or WWG1WGA in their bio. And it was like, holy shit, this is an ARG that's brainwashing people. I could tell, like, right away. The second story I wrote was 2 weeks after I started, and it was, QAnon is an enormous ARG run by malevolent puppet masters. And I had Jim Watkins and Chanel Rion from OAN and Mike fucking Flynn on the cover.
Wow. Already 2 weeks in. Wow.
And, at that point, I was focusing on Jim Watkins because there were a lot of people, because he was the one who was running the website. And I figured, well, shit, if he's running the website where this Q LARP, live action role play, is going on, he must be, if not Q, he's at least the gateway to it, right? And that turned out to be true. And I also pointed out all the obvious Russian connections to Mike Flynn, to OAN, to all these places that were pushing these lies. So it was really clear right away. But as soon as I started mentioning Russian influence, as soon as I started talking about Mike Flynn, as soon as I went, out of this sort of narrow zone of inquiry about it, that's when all the, attacks started. And honestly, that was my clue that I knew that I was right.
You were right. And I think that so much of this feels very exposed and out in the open because of the work of people like you. Back then, I think that there was probably some cloak and dagger stuff going on. And because of your background and your experience and your ability to actually, look at this stuff and see what's behind it, I don't think they had anticipated somebody like you coming through and doing the type of investigation you had done. Because as we know, they had already put their controlled opposition in place. And so
I mean, it was there from the beginning.
Right. It's an important point. It's an important point that the media is still very asleep at the switch when it comes to who and what the controlled opposition are, what they look like, what they do, in trying to obfuscate the truth about this radicalization, setup.
Yeah, I mean, and you say this often. There are no rear areas, right? Like, I thought I had found a group of people who were interested in QAnon and wanted to expose it, but it didn't turn out that way. It turned out they were there to protect it.
Mm-hmm.
And they were there to protect it from people like me. And I refused to shut up.
Mm-hmm.
And, 2.5 years later, I have the fucking scars all over me, but I'm still here.
Well, we're going to talk about that, but can you tell people how you tried to help, how you got connected with Dave Troy and Dr. Stephen Hassan, who works to help get people help who are under undue influence? Can you tell me how that led to the Thinkin' Project and wanting to actually give people help to de-radicalize their loved ones, or if they had been under undue influence? Because you initially tried to help, like with many great things. Let's just talk about the Women's March, Standing Rock, the Resistance, whatever. You got infiltrated, and there are scars from that, but you actually were setting out to try to help people.
Yeah, I mean, I met Dave through Stephen Hassan. So within, I don't know, I think the first time I replied to Stephen on Twitter was like a week after I started, because instantly I knew, oh my God, there are millions of these brainwashed people, and you could just tell right away that like they would shut down. And I knew some stuff about cults because I'd been interested in it, and it was clearly brainwashing. And I thought to myself, holy fuck, how are we going to get tens of millions of people unbrainwashed, right? And so I, just looking around, figured out that man, Dr. Hassan, who wasn't a doctor at the time, by the way, because he's a bulldog, and he got his goddamn PhD in his 60s.
That is so inspirational. Inspirational. Wow.
I mean, he had his PhD in this shit in 40 years ago.
In the 70s when he was love bombed into the Moonies.
Yeah, so he was in the Moonies and also wrote a book called Cult of Trump, which describes this brainwashing process, within the MAGA cult, right?
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, because I was immediately at, what's the solution to this, right?
Yeah.
It was obvious. This is it's some kind of, and at the time I didn't necessarily have, like in the first week, I didn't necessarily have the words for psychological operation, but it became super clear that that's what it was, and that the psychological operation was brainwashing people. And I knew immediately that we were going to need to figure out how to help all those people.
Yeah.
So,
wow.
So I met Dr. Hassan that way and worked with Dave. I've been working with Dave the entire time.
Yeah.
But he introduced us because he knew Dave from TEDx.
It's just
so
incredible.
So that's how that whole thing got started.
And you did a TEDx with Hassan and Troy. That's pretty cool. That's pretty damn cool. Yeah. I mean, all those things. It's important because there's been a massive operation to try to poison your narrative and poison your truth. And let's talk for a moment about how many impressions you were getting on Twitter. how you were aware of what was going to happen January 6th, and how you knew that the front line was going to be these radicalized people and these the army of violent militias. And then, let's just talk about that for a second. You knew what and who was going to be present on January 6th. You were lurking in these dark places and on the telegrams, and while the controlled opposition was saying, "Oh, don't worry about the violence, just worry about COVID," you were like, "Stay home."
Yeah, I spent. So I saw, Trump's wild protest. I mean, I was tracking all of them, right?
Yeah.
Especially Mike Flynn, who a couple of weeks before had been pardoned.
Yeah.
And the first thing he did was go on a QAnon show. He went on In the Matrix on the MG show, which is literally QAnon. Like the opening to the show is, where we go one, we go all, boom, trust the plan. It's like this crazy QAnon show. And Flynn goes on there to encourage his digital soldiers, like a week after he's pardoned. So it was super clear what was going on here. And I saw that Q, and I had a whole battle with Q and E and all these fucking LARPs on Twitter, leading up to 1/6, because I was watching them, and I was watching that the people that were installed at the Pentagon were involved in QAnon, right? Fucking Ezra Cohen-Watnick, I'm going to say it right here, Kash Patel, for God's sake, like, what are these people doing in the Pentagon?
Yeah.
And then I started seeing their influence show up in these LARPs on Twitter. And so I had a whole sort of battle with these LARPs, and I got one of them shut down multiple times, and, it was a whole thing. And that's actually why Q came back up briefly after the election, was because we had managed to get the alt that they were going to put on Twitter suspended.
Okay. Well.
So anyway, I was deeply, not only involved in watching it, but I was actively, and I ain't gonna lie, trying to get it shut down.
Yeah.
And so when Q sort of stopped and switched over to the Big Lie, and Ron Watkins started going crazy and went from like 10,000 followers to 500,000 followers in a couple months.
Shit.
I could see exactly what was going on. And just this morning, Elmo fucking put Ali Alexander back on, which, while is an absolutely despicable act in any measure, is super helpful, because now all of Ali's tweets are right there, the ones that I've been following the entire time and warning about. Where he's like, come to January 6th, 1776, just blatant, there was nothing secret about it. It was just being segmented off into this area, and then the controlled opposition on the other side was like, don't worry about it. No
but
big
you
deal.
you knew of the potential for violence and how dangerous it would be, and that the people who were actually anti-fascist would be the bait, because you've been following the messaging and because of who you saw being installed into the Pentagon. So you knew.
Yes, I did. I knew from their private messages, and I also, had hundreds of sources, in various places.
Amazing.
Because many of them turned out to be ops, to be honest, but I learned as much from the ops as I do from anybody else.
Well, they too want to tell the truth too. They too have a hard time.
They will tell you partial truths.
Yeah.
And the whole project here for me has been, how do you unfuck the record, right? Because it's been layered in nonsense for years, right? There's been 150 different, who is Q theories, right? All designed to distract you from the actual truth, which is very, very simple. There's one man who did the entire thing from beginning to end, and he's still doing it. And he was let back on Twitter by Elmo on the anniversary of January 6th,
which was one big huge.
I cannot think of a more aggressive attack on the United States of America that Elon Musk could do right now, other than maybe, I don't know, crashing his satellites into the space station or some shit. Like, he let Mike Flynn, who is currently shopping a PSYOPs book designed to create civil war, in his pinned tweet.
Yeah.
So all of it, right? Every single thing that we've said is now happening at scale. Exactly like we said. Exactly said. Mike Flynn is a PSYOPs expert who created a PSYOP to radicalize people. Now he put it in a fucking book, right? Why is this a question anymore? Why is there any controversy?
Well, and we also have enough evidence to show that he is doing this in service or in collusion with or side by side with Vladimir Putin. So I think that's the most, I think people who don't want to believe any of this is what they truly need to know.
Like I've said to many people who have cast doubt on whether Mike Flynn is involved with the Russians, fucking Google it. Yeah. Like, seriously, just type Flynn Russia. Ignore the Louise Mensch. Everything else is fucking real. Dude is a Russian asset and has been since 2013. Right? No one wants to go back to when was he in the military last? He was director of the DIA. What happened when he was director of the DIA? In June 2013, he went to GRU headquarters for 4 days, during which time Edward Snowden stole military secrets from Flynn's DIA servers. I mean, and then a few months later, what happens? Vladimir Putin sends little green men into Crimea, and no one knows. The DIA is specifically there to see things like that and tell the administration and fucking do something about it. And he did nothing, which is why we're in the situation we're in now.
Thank you for that. I think it's always very important. I don't think we can state the obvious often enough, because people are so reluctant to hear the truth, and that is part of our war. So I want to talk about two, I think, key things that led up to or preceded your banning on Twitter. While this controlled opposition is going around distracting and poisoning the true narrative, which is very simple, which we just have delineated, you and I meet. The first time we met, we found out we live in the same city, and we were able to meet face to face, which is something I think is very important in all of this, is to actually know people in real life as much as possible. And you broke it down for me. The first time I met you, we didn't do an interview. The second time I met you, we did do an interview. So while all of this obfuscation is going on, I do an interview with you that clearly lays out your investigation for Byline Times. And when I included my most important stories on January 6th, that was number one. And when I included my most important work from the year, the raw transcripts from that is like right up in the top 5. People hearing you with your background and your tenacious investigating what you determined to be real was, I think, vitally important. So that drops. We also become friends, and we form an alliance with a couple other friends, and we do a podcast about this stuff. And we are humming along, and our first guest is Dave Troy, and we have thousands of views and people on Twitter, and your 60,000 muscle, right? 60,000, follower muscle. So then the targeting really ramps up, and you get banned multiple times and ultimately permanently from Twitter. Now, instead of talking about how that went down, I want to talk about what that felt like, because still today I can't even imagine, because my life's work is on that fucking platform. And when I need to find a photo or a thought or an adjective, or when I wrote something, I type in a keyword and there it is. And that would feel like I would be in grief if that had happened to me, and it still may. So it's important to hear your response to that.
Yeah, look, I became very expert at Twitter. I had 60,000 followers, but I was at 30 million impressions a month, which, is punching well above my weight. Many sort of big viral threads. And 45,000 tweets in very well organized threads that would refer to each other. And then, I get attacked by hundreds of people lying about me, and get my voice shut off, right? Get 45,000 tweets, a couple million words, some of the stuff in there, frankly, historic, because I was finding things in real time. And, it was like getting half my brain chopped off. It was horrible. Because I had broken no rules. It was clearly political. And now these hundreds of people are free to lie about me without me being able to defend myself. So it's not only shutting you up, but it's putting you up, naked in front of people without being able to respond.
And I think it's very important to note that the other major thing that happened during that time was the discovery of Mike Flynn doing a cultic prayer, I am prayer, in a Christian church. And your exposure of that really clearly hurt him.
Oh yeah. No, it like he lost a whole chunk of evangelical and, Christian right support during that time, because they saw him leading these people in a cult prayer, in a cult prayer.
Yeah.
And it was verbatim. And then he lied about, where it came from, and I just, and so I had been pointing out the I am and theosophy, without getting into the weeds, those influences in QAnon and across the board in many of the people who were running the show. There were lots of QAnon accounts with I am in their name, and, it was clearly there. And then when I saw Flynn doing that prayer, it was like that, like, again, every single influence from his favorite president, JFK, which is what they're, like, across the board, right? But the I am thing, the theosophy thing, is important because theosophy helped bring Nazism into power. Helena Blavatsky, who started theosophy, invented this idea of the Aryan super race, right? And she did it in this, kind of mystical way that was oblique in its racism, although it was racist. But that turned into what was called Ariosophy. And Ariosophy focused on the Aryan race from Helena Blavatsky's work, and that influenced Hitler's Fourth Reich through Himmler, who built the whole cultic part of Hitlerism. So the root of Mike Flynn's of what Mike Flynn was reading
Right.
and having read back to him in a Christian church
Right.
comes from Helena Blavatsky, comes from the same root of Russian propaganda that has been. I mean, Blavatsky was a Russian emigre who came over to New York and suddenly started doing all this, propaganda. So, I thought it was very important to point out that Mike Flynn was intentionally injecting this into the Christian community, and he didn't like it, and neither did the controlled opposition.
I think that it's also very important to note that after he was exposed doing that prayer, it was not long after that Christian organizations began condemning him as a false prophet and began petitioning to not have him bring his Reawakening tour, Reawaken America tour to their towns. And I think that is that when we talk about, the repercussions, that was a very real repercussion on him. So,
well, absolutely. He also lost, 40% of his Telegram followers or something like that, because I forced him to shut down the comments in his Telegram channel because I had identified police officers and other people in his chat groups who were issuing death threats, like despicable anti-Semitic eliminationist death threats against Anthony Fauci.
Yes. Right.
In his comments on Telegram. And I started threading all of the people who were doing it, and he shut the comments down, and his Telegram channel has been withering for a year until fucking Elmo lets him back on, and now he's got
starts up. Yeah, no, it's all very real and very dangerous, and you can draw a line to how everything played out. And obviously, we continue our show. You continue to do vital work on your Substack. You now have brought your, investigative work to Mastodon. But I want to know, as somebody who hated bullies in your youth and who is now subjected to them, as an adult, I guess, what can you say about that experience and how you managed to, navigate your way through it?
Practice, right? I mean, I think my youth being bullied gave me the tools and understanding to weather it, right? And it's hard. It triggers all kinds of stuff. I mean, I still I have rules with people. Don't send me. I don't want to see people's trolling. I don't want to see this shit because no matter how stupid it is, no matter how unfounded it is, no matter what it is, it's still somebody lying about you. And that fucking hurts. It does. So, I have managed over the years to compartmentalize it both literally and mentally. Now I can just go in there. I don't give a shit. I really, it's not, I am so calloused and scarred that literally, maybe there's another level they could take it to, but
so you've exposed them, they've exposed them. We know who they are. The people whose work is important in this fight are your best friends. And when somebody still tries to come sideways and try to identify you as a misogynist, I just laugh. I'm like, yeah, the least misogynistic person I've ever met.
I'm a misandrist. I don't like dudes at all. I really don't. I if somebody gave me a button right now that said, okay, the world is going to be run by women, now for the next, I don't know, 50 years while men are given a long fucking timeout, I would push the button instantly. I'm dead serious.
That would be a good sci-fi book right there.
Well, there's lots of
Yeah.
sci-fi stories about that. Like
Mhm.
like there's there's an old movie where it's all women who are the dominatrixes over the man and stuff. Like there's lots of fantasy worlds about that stuff. And I it's just about the fact that men's psychology has been, weaponized so brutally by, people who want to, you know, disrupt our lives. Um, the fact that red pill is now like this just vernacular that people throw around, like, oh, he red pilled somebody. Red pill comes from misogyny. Red pill was a Reddit channel that was devoted 100% to attacking women.
Right.
I mean, it was the center of the incel community, and the center of the incel community is where Gamergate came from, right? It's these angry, disaffected men who have social problems that get weaponized by these monsters. So yeah, it's like people come at you wherever your strengths are, right? That's what they do. They weaponize things, like you swift voted John Kerry, who's a war. I'm not calling myself John Kerry, but when you call me a misogynist, which is literally like the last thing I am, it's a little tiny swift boat. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, well, it's all awful. And as someone who, when I first met you, I told you my story, your empathy was so important to me, and you recognized it right away for what it was and what had happened to me. And you being able to identify it gave me like just just somebody who could bear witness to my pain was really necessary for me at that time because I was in terrible grief. Before we close out, I'm going to read you one paragraph from our first Byline Times article. Mike Flynn is the PSYOPs guy in the general. Roger Stone spreads the propaganda on various media outlets, along with Steve Bannon, who brings the billionaires and runs enormous targeting of propaganda operations. Eric Prince trains everybody and executes specific targeting operations from training centers in Wyoming, North Carolina, and Virginia. He trains physical troopers, but he also trains psychological terrorists. Peter Thiel founded MAGA 3X, which was the group that started QAnon.
I mean, still right.
And again, we have to mention Putin, of course, because as you noticed when you were going down all of those dark, interwebby spaces, who always came out smelling like a rose, shirtless looking fly.
I mean, one of the first things I saw when I went to QAnon Twitter was nothing about Russia at all, except for, like you said, macho pictures of Putin and putting it out there as a strong leader or whatever, and attacking China, never Russia, always China, and the chance that organically happened that way is zero.
Exactly.
Like, why is this giant fucking cult super into Putin? Like, what the fuck, guys? Like, why is it so difficult to imagine that this cult, this giant cult that's trying to destroy American democracy and is pro-Putin, that the Russians might have something to do with that? Like, it's just the leaps of logic people go through to justify, minimizing
Yeah.
what's happened here is, never fails to surprise me.
Right. And never fails to alarm me. I think it's very important that people watch your film, American Mindfuck. That film sums up a lot of what we talked about in about 40 minutes. So that's very important. I think it was also very important that moment that you looked at Facebook when you were first initially doing this investigation and you saw how radicalized people you knew had become. I think it's very important for me that I never forget that we do this work, in the hopes that we can have some sort of, impact on, humanity in our small way, but it's also very personal.
Yeah, I mean, so I'd been looking into this cult for a couple of weeks, and I hadn't been to Facebook in a long time because it was such a shithole.
Yeah.
But I went back there, just to kind of check in and see what was going on. It was like, oh my God, like a bunch of people I knew, some distant relatives, other people were QAnon members.
Yeah.
Like a lot. And not only that, but their extended families. Like it was infiltrating the entire thing.
Yeah.
And I wrote a Medium article called "QAnon is coming for you and your family."
Yeah. It's very true.
I wanted to be very clear. And, in the meantime, since I wrote that, I don't know, another 25% of America has been captured by this death cult. I mean, at that point, QAnon itself was still not a giant story, but quickly became one.
So I guess the last thing I want to say, and I think we have to call this episode "Still Right." So perfect, still right, so perfect. Is that you just wrote a piece about how the second insurrection, which just took place in the halls of Congress, is more dangerous than the first one. And can you give our viewers just a couple words on that so they know what to be prepared for 2023?
Yeah. I wrote a piece that said that January 6, 23 was worse than the first insurrection. There were a couple of reasons for that. One, the Republicans in the House, after completely disempowering McCarthy, because the insurrection caucus, the 20 people most responsible for January 6th, were controlling the United States Congress and controlling the narrative on national television for a fucking week, right? Inside Congress, just to elect a traitor, right? So the thing is, on January 6th, they cleared the Congress out, right? Eventually, after the Charles Flynn got done with letting people in, they cleared the building. But on January 6, 23, they were in the building.
Yeah.
And that shit show was just the opening signal, because all that entire branch of government is going to do is try and destroy everything about America. They're going to go after every Fauci and every three-letter agency and the entire government, and they're going to fucking, it's just going to be Elon Musk's Twitter files, but in Congress. And speaking of Elon Musk, on the same day, 1/6, he let Mike Flynn back on the platform, which is just a giant fuck you to America. There's no other way to interpret allowing the man who planned a violent insurrection that got multiple people killed. He let him back on the 2-year anniversary of one of his biggest crimes. Disgusting. So that the confluence of those events said to me, everything that happened at the insurrection is now fortified. It's now inside, right? In Congress, on Twitter, the owner of Twitter let him back on. He can do anything the fuck he wants now. And he is. So that was the reason why I felt that way.
Yeah. And the owner of Twitter, as Fiona Hill says, is transmitting messages for Putin, which brings us full circle to what our fight is. We can't meme this away. We can't, eat popcorn and, watch it all burn. We all have to take action. And this is the action that I like to take, telling these stories to bring the truth in a time of just mass deception. So thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Heidi.
Love you, man. Love you, man.
I love you back.
It was more than all right. Well, that concludes this portion of our Radpod holiday series. We do hope democracy survives this year. And you just summed up. I was interviewed on Byline podcast, right after the midterms, and Adrian Goldberg expected me to be joyful. I'm like, no. Congress is going to be a dangerous shit show, and here we are. First week of the new year. So
yeah.
lots of work ahead.
I mean, the fact that we didn't lose the Senate, that we lost far less in the House, that is in fact a good sign that America is not completely brainwashed. But we still ended up. The Supreme Court has fucked the judiciary for decades, and the legislature is completely disabled. All we got is the executive, and guess what? The legislature is going to go after the executive for the next 2 years.
And I am going to ask our Department of Justice to explain why insurrectionists can be in Congress. So let's answer that question.
That's counterintuitive. It does.
Yeah, it does. It does. That is something we will be focusing on.
Maybe it's just us. Maybe.
Yeah, maybe it's just us.
I mean, I think in in Libya and fucking, whatever third world shitholes you could think of, this is perfectly normal.
Right. I have a great quote that I'm going to take us out on. I am putting together for Betty Dangerous Substack. I'm putting together what our Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens had to say in his dissent about Citizens United. And I think this is one of the most important words of our time. If taken seriously, our colleagues' assumption that the identity of a speaker has no relevance to the government's ability to regulate political speech would lead to some remarkable conclusions. Such an assumption would have accorded the propaganda broadcast to our troops by Tokyo Rose during World War II the same protection as speech by Allied commanders.
We've got Tokyo Rose, on Fox all day.
So I'm going to be raising that because we can no longer allow our freedoms to be weaponized to destroy our country, and that's what our work is going into 2023.